Throughout history, empires were founded with armies but survived on gold. Gold is not just a shiny metal. It is the embodiment of a state's sovereignty, independence, and will to survive even on the darkest day. But today in Moscow, that guarantee has been wiped out. Vladimir Putin is plundering Russia's so-called untouchable sacred treasure, the state's physical gold reserves, to extend his power for a few more months. If you find this video helpful, don't forget to like it and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It began on a quiet morning in Moscow, a moment that should have passed without significance, but instead revealed the kind of institutional panic reserved for nations on the edge of collapse. Deep beneath the city, in the fortified vaults that for decades safeguarded Russia's most sacred financial asset, the first pallets of physical gold bars were rolled out and loaded onto unmarked trucks. These were not routine transfers between ministries or standard accounting maneuvers designed to balance a spreadsheet. This was the moment the Kremlin crossed a line no modern superpower has ever willingly approached. The liquidation of its existential guarantee, the selling off of state gold reserves once considered untouchable even during wars, famines, or national disasters. By the time the operation became visible to intelligence services, billions in strategic reserves had already been siphoned into the hands of oligarchs, state bank insiders, and shadow networks built to preserve the hierarchy of power around Vladimir Putin. And as the trucks moved through the cold streets, escorted by security personnel who understood the gravity of what they were transporting, the question became inescapable. How close did Russia come to triggering not a military confrontation, but a full-scale strategic collapse, one capable of reshaping the global balance of power for years to come? That is the story behind this crisis, and it begins with the moment the Kremlin itself signaled that its sovereignty may no longer be financially sustainable. To understand why this event matters, it is necessary to place Russia's gold reserve liquidation within the broader geopolitical environment of 2025. Gold has never been merely a commodity for nations capable of projecting significant military force. It is a form of deep sovereignty, a strategic buffer designed to ensure survival when access to global markets is restricted, sanctions tighten, or wartime expenditures surge beyond what conventional revenues can cover. For Russia, a nuclear-armed power already isolated from the Western financial system, gold reserves function as the last firewall between national resilience and economic freefall. As sanctions advanced and the war in Ukraine drained the Kremlin's fiscal capacity, Moscow increasingly relied on energy exports to fund its operations. But with oil revenues falling by double digits due to price caps and shrinking global demand, and with yuan reserves from Beijing already stretched, Russia entered 2025 in a financial position far more fragile than its public rhetoric admitted. In this context, the sale of physical gold is not just a sign of stress, it is a strategic alarm. Unlike bonds or currency interventions, gold liquidation is irreversible. It acknowledges that a state has exhausted its routine levers of control. And when a country with nuclear capabilities, global military deployments, and active combat operations begins consuming its last reserves, the implications extend far beyond economics. They touch deterrence credibility, alliance behavior, regional stability, and long-term national power. The collapse of Russia's financial backbone does not remain within Moscow's borders. It radiates into the Baltic, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and even influences the calculations of NATO planners monitoring the Kremlin's ability to sustain military commitments. In short, this crisis is not merely about gold. It is about a superpower's structural weakening and the geopolitical vacuum that follows when a state's financial architecture begins to fail from within. At the center of this unfolding crisis is the Russian state apparatus itself, a network of ministries, banks, intelligence agencies, and elite patronage structures built around Vladimir Putin's administration. Traditionally, the Russian Central Bank and the Ministry of Finance acted as stabilizing institutions, designed to safeguard reserves and maintain the integrity of state wealth. But by late 2025, their influence had eroded. The real actors moving the gold were far less formal. State-controlled banks, oligarchic financial groups, and private networks tied to Kremlin insiders became the primary buyers of the gold flowing out of the vaults. Their motive was survival: convert rapidly devaluing rubles into an asset that could outlast the regime if it fell or withstand sanctions if they intensified. On paper, Russia still maintains one of the world's largest gold reserves, over 2,300 tons, but the effective share available for crisis use is far smaller and shrinking. Opposite these internal players stands the broader international financial system and the intelligence community monitoring the meltdown. Western sanctions have locked Russia out of London, Zurich, and New York markets, meaning any gold sales must occur domestically, at prices and terms dictated by political loyalty rather than global market value. Meanwhile, China, often portrayed as Russia's lifeline, has pursued its own course, accumulating record levels of gold while offering Moscow limited financial relief. In a subtle but strategic move, Beijing has positioned itself to extract maximum leverage from Russia's decline. And then there is the Russian public, the silent but critical participant. Their trust in the ruble, in state stability, and in the future of Russian economic life is being tested by a crisis they did not create but will ultimately pay for. All these actors form the ecosystem surrounding the gold reserve collapse, each playing a role in the erosion of Russian sovereignty. The sequence of events that led to this strategic implosion can be reconstructed with relative clarity thanks to financial data, leaked intelligence assessments, and observable shifts in Russia's domestic markets. At the outbreak of the war, Russia held roughly 405 tons of gold in its National Wealth Fund, an immediately convertible reserve meant for emergencies. For a nation expecting economic pressure but confident in its energy exports, this buffer should have lasted for years. Instead, by November 2025, that figure had fallen to 173 tons, a 57% reduction in just 3 years. The decline was not steady, it accelerated. The first phase, between early 2022 and mid-2023, saw gold sales used primarily to stabilize the ruble after the initial sanctions shock. But as the war dragged on and costs mounted, burned out armor, lost aircraft, and ammunition expenditures that outpaced production capacity, the Kremlin began relying on gold to pay for wartime logistics. Intelligence reporting shows that by late 2024, Russia had already diverted significant reserves to cover salaries of contracted soldiers and to purchase ammunition from Iran and North Korea. The second phase began when global energy prices dipped, an external factor that hit Moscow harder than anticipated. With oil revenues falling 27% and insufficient foreign currency inflows, the Kremlin faced a choice between cutting military operations or liquidating reserves. It chose the latter. In early 2025, gold transfers became more frequent and, crucially, physical rather than accounting-based. What had once been internal adjustments on government balance sheets turned into literal movement of gold bars out of state vaults. A senior intelligence official described the moment as the Kremlin opening the emergency hatch while pretending the ship is stable. By late 2025, the Kremlin authorized plans to sell an additional 230 tons of gold before year's end, with projections indicating a further liquidation of 115 tons in 2026. Here is why that matters. At this pace, Russia's National Wealth Fund will be empty in a few years. Without it, the state loses its capacity to defend the ruble during crises, to stabilize inflation, or to sustain wartime expenditures. As gold flowed outward, a corresponding wave of instability spread inward. Salaries in multiple regions were delayed. Infrastructure budgets were frozen. Basic public services began to fail, not severely, but consistently enough to signal systemic strain. On the street level, Russians began feeling the effects of hyperinflationary pressure. The ruble lost purchasing power faster than the government could manage, and trust in the currency began to fracture. Meanwhile, oligarchs and banks, privy to the scale of the crisis, accelerated their conversion of rubles into gold, creating a feedback loop where state reserves were drained precisely because the elites anticipated further collapse. In intelligence terms, this is what analysts call a liquidity trap with political consequences. Once the elite loses confidence, the system follows. By the time the scale of gold reserve depletion became public knowledge, Russia had already crossed the threshold. It was no longer a matter of preventing crisis, but managing the fallout from one already underway. Although this crisis unfolds in the financial domain rather than on a battlefield, it can be analyzed with the same strategic frameworks used in military assessments. Gold reserves function as a deterrence mechanism, much like missile stockpiles or naval deployments. They provide strategic depth, the ability to absorb shocks while maintaining operational freedom. When reserves decline, the state's maneuver space shrinks, Russia's 2,330-ton gold reserve appears formidable on paper, but only a fraction of that is liquid and available for immediate use. The National Wealth Fund, the primary instrument for flexible crisis management, has been severely depleted. From a technical standpoint, gold reserve depletion affects currency stability, sovereign debt management, and wartime financing. When reserves fall, the central bank loses the ability to defend the ruble against speculative attacks. This reduces confidence among domestic investors and accelerates capital flight. It also undermines military procurement. Russia's long-range missiles, armored vehicle fleets, and drone programs all rely on supply chains that stretch beyond its borders. As liquidity evaporates, the state loses access to components, fuel contracts, and foreign procurement channels. Another technical dimension is the nature of sanctioned economies. Since Russia cannot legally sell gold in major global exchanges, all transactions occur domestically, effectively at a discount, and primarily benefiting the politically connected. The Kremlin's attempt to use gold to fund operations mirrors wartime emergency financing, but without the external support that normally stabilizes an embattled state. A subtle but important factor is China's role. Beijing is rapidly increasing its gold reserves, giving it an asymmetric advantage in any future financial or military confrontation. In contrast, Russia is liquidating its strategic assets. It is a classic case of one power fortifying its defenses while another tears down its own for short-term survival. In military parlance, Russia is cannibalizing its logistics base to sustain a forward operation, an approach that may succeed tactically but fails strategically. In the long term, the depletion of gold reserves erodes deterrence. A nuclear superpower without financial depth becomes vulnerable to economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and internal instability. In effect, Russia is trading long-term sovereignty for short-term, operational continuity. The escalation phase of this crisis is not marked by radar locks or close-pass aircraft, but by a dangerous convergence of internal and external pressures that pushed Russia towards strategic instability. As gold reserves dwindled, the Kremlin faced increasing difficulty funding its war in Ukraine while maintaining domestic stability. This dual pressure created a moment of acute vulnerability. On the internal front, elite networks began shifting their wealth into gold, signaling a loss of confidence in the ruble and in the regime's ability to manage the crisis. Intelligence reports described frantic buying behavior among state bank insiders, behavior typical of actors preparing for regime instability. On the external front, Russia's weakening financial posture reduced its deterrence credibility. NATO analysts began assessing whether the Kremlin might escalate militarily to compensate for internal weakness, a classic pattern in authoritarian regimes under pressure. Meanwhile, China recognized Russia's vulnerability and moved to expand its leverage, offering limited financial support while extracting political concessions. The most dangerous moment came when reserve depletion intersected with battlefield needs. As Russia struggled to acquire ammunition and maintain equipment flows, the Kremlin authorized additional gold sales to finance emergency procurement from Iran and North Korea. In a traditional conflict scenario, escalation occurs when one side misreads the other's intentions. In this case, escalation emerged from Russia's misreading of its own capacity. By consuming its reserves to sustain military operations, the Kremlin placed itself in a position where any additional shock, economic, military, or political, could trigger uncontrolled collapse. That is the geopolitical equivalent of a near-miss engagement. The world witnessed a nuclear-armed state approaching a threshold where financial failure could translate into unpredictable actions, desperate strategies, or regional instability. The crisis did not explode outward, but it came closer than most observers realized. The immediate phase of crisis de-escalation began not with a sudden solution, but with the Kremlin accepting the limits of its position. By late 2025, gold sales slowed slightly, not because reserves had stabilized, but because the leadership recognized that further liquidation risked revealing just how little remained. Instead of solving the problem, Moscow shifted into a posture of controlled decline. Ministries were instructed to cut spending. Infrastructure projects stalled. Regional governments were left to manage shortages on their own. In military terms, this was a forced withdrawal, an admission that Russia could no longer sustain the operational tempo it had attempted to maintain. The Kremlin also sought deeper alignment with China, hoping Beijing would offset the financial shortfall. But China had little incentive to rescue a partner that was rapidly losing strategic value. In essence, Russia stabilized the situation only by lowering its ambitions and accepting shrinking strategic options. No shots were fired. No emergency decrees were issued. The crisis simply transitioned into a slower, more protracted phase, a managed deterioration in which the Kremlin aims not to recover its former strength, but to survive long enough to define its own end state. For Russia, the primary lesson is stark. A superpower cannot sustain war, sanctions, and internal corruption simultaneously without eroding the financial structures that support military strength. Gold reserves are not symbolic. They are the bedrock of national resilience. By liquidating them to sustain a stalemated conflict and reward loyal elites, the Kremlin traded long-term sovereignty for short-term political survival. For China, the lesson is opportunistic. A weakened Russia becomes a strategic asset, a large, resource-rich neighbor increasingly dependent on Beijing's goodwill. For NATO and the United States, this crisis underscores the importance of financial warfare as a component of modern conflict. Economic pressure, when combined with sustained diplomatic coordination, can degrade a rival's strategic capacity without firing a shot. It also highlights a rising risk. A financially unstable nuclear power may become unpredictable. For American planners, the incident reinforces the need to monitor not only Russia's military posture, but its economic resilience. Strategic power is not measured solely in missiles, divisions, or fleets. It is measured in a state's capacity to sustain itself when isolated. Russia's gold reserve collapse demonstrates what happens when a nation sacrifices its financial armor.